Patrick Dalzel-Job had been an unusual British officer even before the war began. He had been born in 1913. His father, an artillery officer, had been killed at Beaumont Hamel on the Somme in 1916. His mother, refusing to remarry, took her surviving child and moved to Switzerland to live on a war widow's pension. Patrick grew up speaking French and German fluently, attended a Swiss school, and then a Norwegian school after his mother moved north in 1929 to escape rising tensions in Central Europe. By 18, he had become an expert skier. By 19, he was qualified as a yacht master and had sailed solo from Bergen to the Faroe Islands. By 22, he had founded his own tiny shipping company in Norway, running schooners up the coast. He spoke Norwegian like a native and German like an educated Berliner. These were unfashionable qualifications for a young British man in the late 1930s. They became, in 1939, almost uniquely valuable. He joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve at the end of 1938, partly because he suspected war was inevitable, partly because his shipping business had stopped paying its bills. He was commissioned as a lieutenant. He requested service with the Royal Naval Patrol Service in the North Atlantic. They put him on a minesweeper. When the Norwegian campaign began in April 1940, the Royal Navy realized that the lieutenant who spoke Norwegian like a native and knew every fjord on the coast was sitting on a minesweeper in Aberdeen. He was reassigned within 48 hours. That was how he came to be at Narvik on the day he refused to follow orders. After Narvik, Dalzel-Job's superiors did the only sensible thing with a man like him. They stopped trying to give him orders and started asking him for suggestions instead. He spent 1941 and most of 1942 attached to a unit called the Naval Intelligence Division, in a small office in the Admiralty building in London. The office reported directly to Admiral John Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence. Godfrey's personal assistant was an unsmiling, chain-smoking commander in his 30s who had been a Reuters correspondent in Moscow before the war. The assistant's name was Ian Fleming. Fleming and Dalzel-Job did not become friends. They worked in the same building. They occasionally drank in the same Admiralty bar. Fleming, by Dalzel-Job's later account, was clever, well-dressed, slightly bored, and extremely good at writing memos that other people would act on. Dalzel-Job was, by Fleming's later notes to colleagues, the most courageous, professional, and impossible junior officer I have ever met. They orbited each other for 2 years. Then, in late 1943, Fleming proposed a new unit. It would be called 30 Assault Unit. Its mission would be to land with the leading wave of any Allied assault, race ahead of the main force into enemy territory, and seize intelligence material, codebooks, naval cipher machines, radar equipment, U-boat designs before the Germans could destroy it. Fleming designed the unit. He recruited the officers. He needed men who could speak the local language, operate independently behind enemy lines, and fight if they had to. Patrick Dalzel-Job was on the list of the first 6. He landed in Normandy on the morning of the 11th of June, 1944, 5 days after D-Day, at the head of a small Royal Marine Intelligence section. The Allied front line had stalled. The Germans were holding Caen. Dalzel-Job, riding a captured German motorcycle, slipped through a gap in the German line, ahead of any British armored unit, and entered the village of Douvres-la-Delevrande. He was carrying a Webley revolver, 2 grenades, a hand-drawn map of the German radar station nearby, and a single Royal Marine corporal in the sidecar. He arrived at the radar station to find it abandoned. The Germans had retreated overnight, taking most of the technical equipment with them. Dalzel-Job spent 6 hours photographing what remained, identified the model designations of the surviving radar components, and slipped back through the lines to make his report. He repeated this exercise a dozen more times over the next 10 weeks. He took the surrender of a German garrison commander on his own, with no troops behind him, by riding into the village on his motorcycle and informing the commander, in fluent German, that the rest of the Royal Marines were 10 minutes away. They were not. He seized a German naval headquarters at Cherbourg by walking into it with a Sten gun and a lieutenant from the Free French. He recovered an intact TV radar set, one of the most advanced German naval radars, by being the first Allied officer into the German Naval Research Facility at The Hague. In the autumn of 1944, the British High Command finally caught up with what 30 Assault Unit was actually doing, and assigned them to the leading wave of every major Allied advance for the rest of the war. Dalzel-Job led, by the end of the war, more than 200 separate operations behind enemy lines. The last of them was in northern Germany in May 1945. The objective in May 1945 was the German Naval Research Facility at Bremerhaven. The facility was believed to contain the only working examples of a new type of German submarine, the Walter boats, the type XX boats, and the complete design archives for the German Navy's wartime research program. The problem was that Bremerhaven was in what was about to become the Russian zone of occupation. The Russians were also racing for it. Dalzel-Job took a section of Royal Marines and a borrowed Bedford lorry, and drove north through what was left of the disintegrating German army. He passed through 3 German-held villages without firing a shot, accepting their surrenders on the strength of his fluent German and his assertion that British armored columns were directly behind him. He entered Bremerhaven on the morning of the 3rd of May, 1945, 5 days before the official end of the war in Europe. He found the Naval Research Facility largely intact. He arrested the senior German naval officers on the premises. He sealed the technical archives. He stationed Royal Marine sentries at every entrance. He held the facility for 36 hours with a handful of Marines, against the diplomatic objections of a Russian liaison officer who arrived at the gate on a captured German motorcycle and demanded to be let in. Dalzel-Job, by his own account, was polite. He invited the Russian officer to take tea in the German admiral's office. He pointed out that the British Royal Marines were holding the building, and that the Russian officer was welcome to wait outside until the formal allocation of occupation zones had been settled in Berlin. The Russian officer waited. By the time formal arrangements were made, and Bremerhaven was confirmed as a British zone, the British Technical Intelligence Team had photographed, catalogued, and partially dismantled the entire German submarine research archive. The submarines that the Royal Navy seized that week became the basis of NATO submarine development for the next 30 years. Patrick Dalzel-Job retired from the Royal Navy in 1947, at the rank of commander. He was 34 years old. He held the Distinguished Service Order, 3 mentions in dispatches, and the Norwegian Knight Cross with sword. He had been shot at on every front of the European war except Italy. He had been parachuted, landed, sailed, motorbiked, and walked into 7 occupied countries. He had operated behind enemy lines for an estimated 400 days in total. He moved with his Norwegian wife to a small white cottage in the Highlands of Scotland, a place called Plockton, on the western coast looking toward Skye. He worked, for the rest of his life, as a small boat skipper, ferrying passengers and supplies between the islands. He raised 3 sons. He went to the parish church every Sunday. He answered no journalists' questions. In 1952, Ian Fleming published Casino Royale. The novel's protagonist was a Royal Navy commander, fluent in several European languages, comfortable behind enemy lines, attached to the Naval Intelligence Division, and capable of operating with almost no regard for the orders he had been given. The character's name was James Bond. When the books became famous, journalists began trying to identify the real-life model. There were several candidates. Fleming himself had served in naval intelligence, and the director he had worked for, Admiral Godfrey, was widely thought to be the model for M. Bond's superior. The novelist Christopher Creighton claimed to be Bond. The wartime intelligence officer Wilfred Dunderdale claimed to be Bond. Sidney Riley, the World War I spy, was claimed by his biographers to be Bond. Patrick Dalzel-Job, when asked, said he did not know. He pointed out in a letter to one journalist, never read any of Mr. Fleming's books. He said, never met Mr. Fleming for more than a few minutes at a time in the corridors of the Admiralty. He had no opinion about the matter. He preferred not to be interviewed. He died in 2003, at the age of 90. He had spent 56 years living in the same small white cottage. He had not, until the end of his life, ever appeared in a newspaper photograph. His memoir, written reluctantly only after extreme pressure from his sons, was published in 1991. It is 60,000 words long. It mentions James Bond only once in the foreword, where Dalzel-Job notes politely that he is not Bond, never was Bond, and that the comparison embarrasses him. He was, in fact, not Bond. He was, very probably, simply the man who Fleming had been watching 2 desks away in a London office, while he was working out what kind of man Bond would have to be. If the story stayed with you, there are more like it. Quiet men who did improbable things on their own initiative, then went home and never talked about them. New stories every week on the Untold front. Subscribe to follow the names that history almost forgot. Next time, a different cottage.